Yes.
Unbecoming. He was a sex offender.
Yeah.
Prince Andrew has long lived under the shadow of rumors.
Do I regret the fact?
What happens when a life of privilege becomes a life of unchecked recklessness? When the carefully crafted persona of a prince collapses under the weight of decades of entitlement, audacity, and moral blindness? Prince Andrew's story is not just one of scandal. It is a portrait of a man whose upbringing, indulgence, and unchecked power shaped a lifetime of misjudgments, humiliations, and ultimately, disgrace. From the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace to the global headlines that would later define him, Andrew's journey is a warning of how privilege without accountability can turn charm into catastrophe. Watch closely, because by the end, you will understand why the world came to despise Prince Andrew. Born into a palace where golden-crusted walls shielded him from consequences, Andrew was a child whose every whim could be indulged. By the time he reached 5, the foundations of his carefully curated public image had already been laid. And yet, behind the facade of a charming royal son lurked a boy who believed that rules applied only to others. This was a life in which the consequences of misbehavior were minimal, inconsistently applied, and often protective of his ego. Andrew's early experiences, whether indulged by parents or ignored by staff, would serve as a blueprint for the man he would become, one whose charm masked a darker, more reckless nature. Among the earliest anecdotes that foreshadowed his adult misbehavior was an incident in the stables of Windsor Castle. According to biographer Ingrid Seward, young Andrew wandered into the stable yard, a place where guards and grooms carried out centuries-old duties with quiet precision. Andrew, full of curiosity and a nascent sense of entitlement, mocked their posture, kicked dogs, and swung sticks at the horses. When the stable staff asked him to stop, he defied them. 2 grooms, exhausted by his provocations, eventually lifted him and threw him into a pile of manure, shoveling dung over him as a lesson in consequence. Humiliation, yes, but a lesson that should have mattered was quickly forgotten. No adult ensured the boy internalized the boundaries, and thus, a dangerous pattern was established: provoke, test limits, and survive the consequences with little repercussion. Another early incident reinforced this lesson. Andrew taunted a footman so aggressively that the man, in defiance of royal protocol, struck Andrew, giving him a black eye. While most children would be disciplined or shielded, Andrew remained untouched. The Queen considered the strike deserved. The footman stayed unpunished. From this, the young prince absorbed a key understanding: power lies not in restraint, but in provoking others, and privilege guarantees protection. These moments, seemingly trivial in isolation, were prophetic sketches of the behavior that would define him in adulthood. A boy who mocked guards would grow into a man who demanded curtains be drawn just so, and who terrorized staff with minor infractions over stuffed animals arranged in precise lines. What appeared eccentric to outsiders was daily abuse to those serving him. By adolescence, Andrew's divergence from his public image became more pronounced. While the world was enchanted by the royal family's polished appearances, Andrew was quietly building a reputation as spoiled, arrogant, and alarmingly immature. Inside palace walls, staff described a young man with a god complex, demanding obedience, and terrified by imperfection. One maid, Charlotte Briggs, recounted incidents where Andrew screamed over minor mistakes: a gap in the curtains, a misaligned stuffed bear, revealing a level of cruelty masked by wealth and power. The monarchy's indulgence of his whims, coupled with his father's labeling of him as the spare, allowed Andrew to exercise his privileges unchecked, reinforcing a worldview in which the rules existed for everyone else but him. Andrew's adult persona, at least publicly, was intended to be that of the charismatic, dashing youngest son, a military hero, a bachelor prince whose romances would captivate the public imagination. Yet, even as his image was carefully groomed for public consumption, Andrew was developing private behaviors that would define him in ways far less flattering. By the 1980s, while Princess Diana captivated global attention with grace and compassion, Andrew's reputation within palace walls leaned toward entitled excess. Household staff observed his temper, obsession with appearances, and relentless need for admiration, noting that his charm was often a veneer masking cruelty and recklessness. Marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 should have been a stabilizing milestone, a fairy tale union reinforcing public affection. Instead, it became another chapter in a life defined by scandal and Andrew's reputation as Randy Andy became cemented in the tabloids, as he flaunted wealth, pursued high-profile romances, and carried himself as untouchable. Ferguson herself was caught in compromising situations, their marital discord fueling rumors that further tarnished the monarchy's image. The couple's divorce in 1996 did not diminish Andrew's notoriety. Instead, it provided new fodder for speculation and public outrage. Within the palace, Andrew's status shifted from heir apparent's charming younger brother to unpredictable liability. The 1990s deepened public scrutiny of Andrew's behavior. While Britain faced economic challenges, Andrew's lifestyle remained extravagant. Private jets, helicopters, and lavish holidays earned him the derisive nickname Air Miles Andy, reflecting both his personal indulgence, and the public perception of royal wastefulness. Staff and citizens alike criticized him for using his military title and royal influence to gain privileges and evade accountability. Despite mounting criticism, Andrew's confidence remained unshaken. He believed his royal status provided immunity, and, in many ways, the palace's protective measures reinforced that belief, shielding him from debt, embarrassment, and consequence. Andrew's obsession with status and admiration extended beyond wealth into social circles. Friends and associates noted his gullibility, his desire to be flattered, and his willingness to associate with anyone who enhanced his perceived importance. By the late 1990s, his naval career had concluded, leaving him searching for relevance. Appointed a trade envoy, Andrew was intended to represent British interests abroad. Instead, he transformed the role into an avenue for personal networking, leveraging his royal name for access and influence. Diplomatic cables and reports revealed arrogance, rudeness, and dismissive behavior that embarrassed British officials and tarnished international relationships. The most damning chapter of Andrew's life began with his introduction to Jeffrey Epstein by Ghislaine Maxwell. Andrew, captivated by wealth, luxury, private jets, and access to celebrities, ignored warnings about Epstein's behavior and associations. He embraced the lifestyle without considering the moral or legal consequences, blinding himself to the risks inherent in such relationships. Staff who had long endured his temper and entitlement later recognized a pattern. Andrew's indulgence of privilege, disregard for boundaries, and desire for status had now escalated into moral recklessness with global repercussions. Public exposure followed in horrifying fashion. Photographs emerged, documenting Andrew with Virginia Giuffre, then Virginia Giuffre, a minor, and Ghislaine Maxwell smiling in the background. The images shocked the world. Two palace staff. They were confirmation of what they had long suspected. Andrew's lifelong patterns of entitlement, cruelty, and recklessness had culminated in the worst imaginable public humiliation. The boy who had terrorized staff with tantrums over stuffed animals had become a man whose indiscretions threatened the monarchy itself. By the close of the 1990s, Andrew's reputation had deteriorated beyond repair. Even palace insiders began questioning his role, responsibilities, and the future of his public image. His divorce from Sarah Ferguson, which might have offered a fresh start, instead opened a new chapter of scandal and humiliation. Privilege, indulgence, and the absence of accountability, once protective, now magnified every misstep. From childhood provocations to adult indiscretions, Andrew's story became a cautionary tale of how unchecked power, entitlement, and moral negligence can transform charm into catastrophe. And in conclusion, Prince Andrew's life serves as a stark reminder that privilege without accountability is not harmless, it is corrosive. The carefully constructed image of a charismatic prince was always at odds with a private reality shaped by indulgence, cruelty, and reckless pursuit of status. From gilded stables to global headlines, every misstep followed a predictable pattern. Early entitlement, reinforced by indulgent caretakers; adolescent cruelty, masked by charm; adult recklessness, protected by privilege; and finally, public disgrace, exposed for all the world to see. What the world witnessed was not a sudden fall from grace, but the inevitable result of a lifetime of unchecked indulgence and moral neglect. By understanding Andrew's story, we see how power, privilege, and protection can distort human character, and why the public reacted to shock, anger, disgusties, not just deserved, but necessary. As the new millennium unfolded, Andrew's past behaviors began to catch up with him in ways that were impossible to ignore. Allegations of sexual misconduct surfaced, linked directly to his connections with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Unlike earlier scandals that revolved around wealth, extravagance, or childish tantrums, these accusations carried real-world consequences: lawsuits, media frenzy, and the scrutiny of law enforcement agencies. The public, already aware of his reckless indulgences, now had tangible evidence of behavior that went far beyond privilege or eccentricity. The fallout was swift. Social media buzzed, newspapers exploded with investigative pieces, and public figures distanced themselves. Citizens, long frustrated by Andrew's perceived immunity, finally saw the law begin to intersect with royal privilege. He was no longer just Randy Andy, or Air Miles Andy. He had become a symbol of entitlement gone unchecked, and, now, potentially criminal. Each allegation painted a picture of a man who had consistently blurred the line between privilege and predation, leaving observers horrified and incredulous. Inside Buckingham Palace, reactions were mixed, but telling. The monarchy faced a dilemma: shield Andrew, the son of the Queen, and risk reputational damage, or allow consequences to unfold publicly. Historically, the palace had always insulated him from real accountability, smoothing over debts, mitigating scandals, and protecting his image in the media. But this time, the stakes were different. The legal implications, the photographic evidence, and the international attention made it impossible to maintain the same levels of secrecy. Staff and aides, who had long witnessed Andrew's cruelty, entitlement, and recklessness, privately expressed concern. Some had predicted that his behavior would inevitably result in catastrophe, but few could have foreseen the scale of public outrage and legal scrutiny that would follow. The palace's protective mechanisms were strained, and even the Queen's interventions could not prevent Andrew from becoming the center of a scandal that threatened the monarchy's credibility. In 2019, Andrew's attempt to publicly rehabilitate his image backfired spectacularly. The BBC interview, intended to clarify his position and defend his reputation, instead amplified public disdain. His explanations, perceived as evasive and disconnected from reality, offered neither apology nor insight. The world watched a prince who had lived a life of protection and privilege struggle to understand the consequences of his own actions. Observers noted a pattern consistent with Andrew's entire life: deflection, arrogance, and a lack of empathy. The child who mocked staff and survived without consequence had grown into a man who underestimated the court of public opinion. The interview not only failed to rehabilitate his image, it crystallized the public perception of Andrew as reckless, entitled, and morally compromised. Following public backlash, Andrew was forced to step back from royal duties. Military titles, patronages, and honorary roles were returned to the crown, severing his public association with official royal representation. For a man who had long enjoyed immunity, authority, and social status, this was a profound humiliation. Privilege, once protective, had lost its power. The loss of these roles was symbolic as well as practical. No longer able to leverage his position for influence or social access, Andrew became, in many ways, a private citizen under extraordinary scrutiny. The contrast between his gilded upbringing and this public degradation was stark, highlighting how a life built on entitlement could crumble once accountability finally intervened. Civil suits filed by Virginia Giuffre and others further eroded Andrew's defenses. Documents, witness testimonies, and corroborating evidence painted a detailed narrative of his alleged actions. While legal settlements avoided criminal conviction, they confirmed what palace insiders and the public had long suspected: Andrew had consistently exploited privilege and ignored moral boundaries. These lawsuits brought not only financial consequences, but permanent reputational damage. Every revelation, every corroborated story, reinforced the image of a man whose behavior had long been tolerated but was now undeniable. The narrative that had once allowed Andrew to evade consequences for decades now collapsed entirely. The media, once fascinated by Andrew's charm and scandals, shifted toward relentless critique. Documentaries, exposes, and investigative journalism dissected every aspect of his life: childhood entitlement, adolescent cruelty, adult recklessness, and eventual exposure. Public perception, which had oscillated between curiosity and disdain, hardened into near-universal condemnation. Andrew's story became a cultural touchstone for discussions about privilege, power, and the failures of institutions to hold the wealthy accountable. Analyzes highlighted patterns of behavior that began in childhood and escalated unchecked, demonstrating the intersection of upbringing, indulgence, and systemic protection. Ultimately, Prince Andrew's life illustrates a universal lesson: privilege without accountability is not merely indulgent, it is dangerous. Each scandal, each misjudgment, each public humiliation is a consequence of patterns established decades earlier. From the stables of Windsor Castle to global media headlines, Andrew's trajectory shows how early indulgence, unchecked entitlement, and systemic protection can combine to produce public catastrophe. Observers, insiders, and historians alike have noted that Andrew's downfall was not sudden but inevitable. The boy who mocked staff and defied rules, who demanded obedience and flouted boundaries, became the adult who underestimated consequences, embraced risky associations, and ultimately became a cautionary tale for generations. The arrest and eventual death of Jeffrey Epstein in 2019 intensified scrutiny on Andrew's connections. Suddenly, the friendship he had cultivated for decades, once glamorous, indulgent, and status-driven, was seen as a glaring moral failure. The public was horrified at the realization that Andrew, the prince whose image had once been carefully groomed for charm and heroism, had entangled himself in one of the most notorious criminal networks in history. Every photo, every anecdote, every association with Epstein was dissected. Media outlets around the globe portrayed Andrew not as a victim of circumstance but as a willing participant. Blinded by privilege and status, social media erupted with anger, memes, and campaigns demanding accountability. The prince who had lived a life insulated by wealth and monarchy was now confronted with universal condemnation, an inevitability born from years of unchecked behavior. The scandal forced Andrew to step back from public duties. Patronages, ceremonial roles, and military affiliations were stripped or returned to the crown, leaving him largely isolated. Even within the royal family, whispers of disapproval turned into quiet distancing. The queen, historically protective of her son, faced impossible choices: maintain loyalty or preserve the monarchy's credibility. Andrew's isolation was both public and private. Once the darling of palace life, he became a figure shunned by tradition. Stripped of the privileges he had long taken for granted, palace insiders who had witnessed his early cruelty, his tantrums, and his self-serving behavior saw this as the inevitable result of a lifetime of entitlement, a reckoning long overdue. Legal settlements added a tangible layer to Andrew's downfall. Civil suits, most prominently from Virginia, imposed financial obligations that, while undisclosed in full detail, symbolized the first real cost of a life previously free from consequence. Settlements did not erase the damage but crystallized it. Andrew was no longer protected merely by reputation or royal connection. There were financial and moral reckonings to face. This period marked a new chapter where indulgence met consequence. No amount of palace protection, public charm, or old-school loyalty could shield him from the legal and financial repercussions of decades of reckless decisions. The lifelong insulation he had enjoyed had come to a jarring end. Media scrutiny reached a fever pitch. Investigative journalists, documentaries, and exposes painted a comprehensive picture of Andrew's life, from spoiled child to reckless adult, from charming prince to public pariah. The prince who had once been fodder for tabloids over love affairs and luxurious jets now became the subject of serious discussions about accountability, privilege, and abuse of power. His story became emblematic of a broader societal conversation, the consequences of wealth and status unchecked by law, morality, or empathy. Across the globe, Andrew was no longer simply a figure of curiosity, he was a cautionary tale, a living example of how privilege, when combined with moral negligence, can culminate in public disgrace. Public opinion turned decisively against Andrew, where once indulgent behavior might have been laughed off. Every action, association, and indulgence became a symbol of arrogance and moral failure. Royal fans, critics, and neutral observers alike questioned how someone so repeatedly shielded could have evaded justice for so long. Andrew's brand of entitlement, arrogant, reckless, was no longer tolerated. The prince who had been celebrated for charm and status was now universally condemned for recklessness, complicity, and moral blindness. The loss of public trust marked the most profound and lasting damage to both Andrew and, by extension, the monarchy he represented. Palace staff and insiders offered insights that further illuminated Andrew's lifelong patterns. Many had observed the same tendencies from childhood: indulgence without boundaries, cruelty masked as eccentricity, obsession with status, and inability to acknowledge mistakes. For those within the palace, the scandals were confirmation, not surprise. Statements and memoirs from former aides underscored a simple truth: Andrew had been consistently shielded from consequences. The pattern was predictable, the trajectory almost inevitable. Privilege had protected him for decades, but it had also enabled a life of recklessness whose consequences were now fully visible to the public eye. As of now, Andrew exists largely in a state of social and public exile, with no formal royal duties, diminished public appearances, and a tarnished reputation. His presence is defined by scandal rather than achievement. The public narrative emphasizes moral failure over childhood privilege or family dynamics. Every association with wealth, fame, and power is scrutinized for potential misdeeds. This isolation and scrutiny underscore a central lesson: when charm, privilege, and indulgence are untempered by accountability, the eventual reckoning is inevitable. Andrew's life story serves as a stark example of how lifelong protection can delay, but never prevent, the consequences of unchecked behavior. Prince Andrew's legacy is no longer defined by charm, military service, or royal connections. Instead, it is defined by scandal, controversy, and public outrage. Decades of privilege and indulgence, once shielded by the monarchy, have now culminated in a narrative that overshadows every accomplishment. Where the world once celebrated a dashing young prince, it now remembers a figure whose actions serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement without accountability. The contrast between early promise and public disgrace is stark. Andrew's story is one of missed opportunities, moral failings, and the inevitable consequences of a life spent exploiting privilege. For historians and royal observers, he will always represent the dangers inherent when power is unchecked and indulgence is rewarded rather than corrected. The life of Andrew highlights a critical lesson: protection without accountability can create a dangerous cycle. From childhood tantrums to adult scandals, every stage of his life demonstrates a consistent pattern. Those who shield him, parents, palace staff, and the institution itself, modeled behaviors that escalated over time. Early misbehavior that could have been corrected was tolerated, allowing arrogance, entitlement, and recklessness to flourish. Observers note that Andrew's life exemplifies the perils of unchecked power. Privilege, when used as a shield from consequences, does not just protect, it amplifies the consequences when the protection finally fails. The eventual reckoning is always more severe, public, and unrelenting. Royal advisors and palace insiders often describe Andrew as a unique challenge. Unlike other members of the family, whose public images were carefully managed, Andrew's behavior often defied conventional control. From reckless socializing to controversial associations, he tested the limits of palace patience and strategy. Advisors acknowledged that while he was charming and socially adept in certain contexts, His inability to adhere to boundaries created repeated crises. Every scandal from extravagant spending to associations with disreputable figures forced the monarchy into damage control, demonstrating the difficulty of balancing loyalty with institutional survival. The global public, once fascinated by the charisma of royalty, reacted with widespread condemnation as the full scope of Andrew's behavior came to light. Social media campaigns, petitions, and public commentary highlighted collective disgust, moral outrage, and incredulity. The perception was clear. A man who had lived a life of privilege, indulgence, and moral recklessness could not escape scrutiny forever. Andrew became a symbol of unchecked entitlement, a cautionary example of what happens when wealth, power, and family protection insulate wrongdoing. The public's judgment and flinching, detailed and pervasive, ensured that his actions would not fade quietly into obscurity. The repercussions of Andrew's actions extend beyond personal scandal. They impact the monarchy itself. The institution, historically protective of its own, faced unprecedented scrutiny. Critics questioned why privilege allowed him to act with impunity for decades, and why systemic protections failed to enforce accountability. Andrew's downfall serves as a lesson. No amount of royal privilege can permanently shield moral failings from public exposure. The monarchy must navigate the delicate balance of family loyalty, institutional integrity, and public accountability, lessons painfully underscored by the prince's trajectory from charm to scandal. Ultimately, Andrew will be remembered not as a prince of charm or military distinction, but as a cautionary tale. Public memory focuses on scandals, associations with Epstein, lawsuits, and the failures of protection. These elements have come to define his story. Eclipsing any accomplishments or titles he once held, his life story illustrates the corrosive effects of privilege without consequence, the dangers of indulgence, and the moral lessons ignored by a protective institution. To the public, Andrew is a figure of fascination, disdain, and reflection, a living reminder of how entitlement can evolve into public disgrace. Prince Andrew's journey from the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace to global scandal serves as a stark illustration of how power, indulgence, and privilege can distort character. Childhood misbehavior tolerated as eccentricity, adolescent arrogance shielded by family loyalty, and adult recklessness amplified by wealth created a life destined for public humiliation. This is not a story of a sudden fall. It is the story of decades of indulgence, mistakes, and failures of accountability. Every photograph, every lawsuit, and every headline serves as a reminder: when privilege is unchallenged, the consequences are inevitable, often catastrophic, and remembered long after titles and public appearances fade. Today, Prince Andrew exists largely in isolation, both publicly and socially. Stripped of royal duties and stripped of key patronages, he is no longer a visible representative of the monarchy. His appearances are rare, cautious, and heavily scrutinized. Friends and associates who once sought to enjoy the privileges of his company now keep distance, wary of public perception and ongoing legal scrutiny, even within royal circles. Andrew is a figure to be approached with caution. His past indiscretions and public scandals have created a barrier that is nearly impossible to bridge. The man once celebrated for charm and status now navigates a world of suspicion, judgment, and diminished influence. The palace has made clear that his role is limited. His actions are monitored, and any misstep carries the weight of both public and institutional scrutiny. Despite years of public exposure, media interest in Andrew's life has not waned. Investigative journalism, documentaries, and news coverage continue to revisit his past actions, legal settlements, and associations. Each report reinforces the narrative of privilege, recklessness, and moral failure that is defined his adult life. Legal attention remains a constant shadow. Civil settlements, public testimony, and ongoing investigations ensure that Andrew's actions are continuously dissected. This persistent scrutiny serves as a reminder that wealth and status may delay accountability, but they cannot prevent it entirely. The public continues to analyze every association, every photograph, and every statement, keeping Andrew's story at the forefront of discussions about accountability, entitlement, and institutional responsibility. Prince Andrew's life, in its totality, serves as a cautionary tale for future generations. His story demonstrates how early indulgence, unchecked privilege, and systemic protection can produce patterns of behavior with long-term consequences. From childhood cruelty to adult scandals, every stage of his life illustrates the dangers of entitlement without accountability. His legacy is a mixture of notoriety and warning, a reminder that charm, status, or family protection cannot replace moral integrity. Institutions, families, and individuals observing his trajectory can glean lessons about boundaries, responsibility, and the inevitable consequences of a life lived without consequence. In the public memory, Prince Andrew will remain not as a dashing prince, but as a symbol of what happens when power, privilege, and indulgence collide with moral recklessness.